Birth of a Nation. So this is a case of a film which has been, mired in celebration and controversy, perhaps obscuring the film. So it is the story of slave uprising from the 19th century, led by Nat Turner, who was a preacher who led this brief but significant revolt. The story has not been told in a feature film before. So in that respect, this is significant. So when we meet him, he is the son of slaves who at an early age is invited into the big house because he's incredibly intelligent and he is taught to read from the Bible. He has an incredible propensity for reading and indeed for religion. He clearly has a calling for religion, but is then cast back out and back into slavery in the fields. He becomes a preacher whose knowledge runs rings around the knowledge of his owners. They want to use him to preach in order to keep down any possibility of rebellion. But his understanding of the scriptures goes so far beyond that he becomes a rebellious force that they cannot control. At one point, he ends up baptizing a white man, which outrages Armie Hammer's character. Here's a clip.
We've been good to you. My whole family has. And you go on and do something like this to me. I'm baptizing a white man on my property. Do you know how this makes us look? This could ruin everything we worked for. Boy, you'd better say something, and quick.
Take heed, therefore, unto yourselves and to all the flock over the which the Holy Ghost hath made you overseers, to feed the church of God, which he has purchased with his own blood.
Exhort servants to be obedient unto their own masters, and to please them well in all things, not answering again.
You are bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men.
He that shall blaspheme against the Holy Ghost hath never forgiveness, but is in danger.
Beware of false prophets who come dressed in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravening wolves.
So the title of the film itself is provocative. Obviously, it's taking the title from D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which is a famous case of something which is considered to be a sort of landmark of cinema, and yet is this, politically glorifies the Ku Klux Klan, and is a really it's so problematic that when it was finally released on video in the UK, James Furman insisted that there was a historical disclaimer put at the beginning of it, kind of explaining it away, and saying, this is a historical document, but we understand that it's deeply racist. Now, doing that kind of appropriation is not entirely new. Oscar Micheaux, who directed Within Our Gates from 1920, which I think is the oldest surviving film by an African-American director. Within Our Gates takes its title from a quote from Birth of a Nation, and that very, very deliberately sort of takes that story and inverts it and, looks at it. And there's a really extraordinary piece of work that was recently involved in the BFI's Black Star season. I did an introduction for it. I mean, it's a really sort of remarkable piece of work, and actually the fact that it exists is extraordinary. At one point it was considered to be lost. Also, when in the 1980s Spike Lee was at NYU, he made a short film called The Answer, which he said almost got him thrown out of college, which was him making a riposte to Birth of a Nation. He said at NYU they showed the film, they talked about the great innovations that D.W. Griffith came up with. They never talked about how this film was used as a recruiting tool for the Klan. And, and they said the faculty took it like I was attacking the father of cinema, so they wanted to kick me out. So it is... that appropriation of that title is something which has a historical past. Now, in the case of this, Nate Parker writes, directs, and stars in the movie, which became something of a political football. It played at Sundance in the middle of the Oscars So White campaign, and it was received rapturously. There were all these discussions about racism within Hollywood, and this film seemed like an antidote to it, and people were very, very enthusiastic about it. It was bought for I think at that point, a record-breaking sum of money. But one of the things that in the story by Parker and Gene Celestine is that there are two rapes that are referred to in the story, which then prompted journalists to revive stories of a rape allegation from 1999, which Parker was acquitted. Celestine's conviction was later overturned, but the resurfaced details then became part of a sort of controversy and consternation publicly, which led to boycotts against the film. And boycotts against the film, which even some people in the film themselves said they understood. So the film then went from being, on the one hand, very, very celebrated to, on the other hand, suddenly in this position when its cachet had disappeared amidst this controversy, and it opened at the box office in America and didn't do anything like as well as people expected it to, and it is now pretty much dropping off the awards radar. So the question then is, well, what about the film itself? When you look at it in the cold light of day, is how does the film stand up? And the honest truth of it is that if you remove from all that stuff, both the stuff lauding it and the stuff criticising it, it's not that great of a film. It's oddly ordinary. And the ordinariness of it is to do with its cinematic language. It is a peculiarly, although the story itself is obviously a really important story, the language of the cinema is very televisual. And one of the things that the director has said, and Starr has said, is that he looked as a sort of inspirational guiding light toward Mel Gibson's Braveheart. And I think it absolutely shows. He talked to Gibson about filming certain scenes. And I have never liked Braveheart. You remember when we were at Radio 1 when Braveheart first came out, and it was a huge hit. And it was a massively celebrated film. I always thought that Braveheart took a historical circumstance and then managed to turn it into something that was melodramatic and felt artificial. And also, weirdly, in the case of Mel Gibson, felt oddly vain, the way in which he was sort of directing himself as this kind of heroic figure. And there are certainly elements of that you see in Birth of a Nation. If you compare, there's also, to be honest, touches of the Passion of the Christ. There are sort of, scenes which approach that kind of, Gibson's approach to the martyrdom in Passion of the Christ as well, and not in a way which entirely makes sense. It is solidly made, but I have to say unremarkable. If you compare it to 12 Years a Slave and what Steve McQueen did with the language of cinema and cinema, that film was incredibly successful and did end up garnering awards. And I think rightly so, because it's a far superior film. So I think as far as the actual film itself is concerned, when you take it away from all the context of it, it's not a film that's good enough to have ridden out the controversies. It's also not. I don't think it benefited either from being held up as being the great potential masterpiece when it played at Sundance, which is, it isn't. It's a solid, if I have to say, rather predictable piece of work in terms of its cinematic language. And that's a problem which, again, is sort of flagged up even more so by invoking Birth of a Nation, because it's, because of where it stands in cinema history. So, not without some merits, but certainly not a film whose shoulders are broad enough to carry the legacy and the controversy with which it has been saddled.